Any author hammering away at their manuscript likely dreams of the day when they get to hold a copy of the finished book in their hands. But how do you know what that finished book will look like? It all comes down to book design. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for curious writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and I'm here with Kristin Donnelly, Kate Leahy, and Andrea Nguyen. How y'all doing today?
Hey, Molly.
Doing well.
I am super excited about today's conversation about the cookbook design process.
Woohoo!
Well, honestly, this is the area that still mystifies me the most.
Nah.
Yes, really. When I first started writing cookbooks, I almost felt like I imagined the manuscript was this caterpillar that morphed into a beautiful book somehow. And I had no idea how that was happening. Sure, I understand a little bit better right now, but there's still so much I don't know that remains unclear and really still kind of mystifies me. So let's go back to the beginning. For you guys, when you've come up with a new book idea, say you're writing the proposal, do you envision a finished book, a book design? Do you have a sense of what it might look like or feel like?
No, yes and no. I think anyone who's writing a book always has the idea that it's going to be something that's very cool or beautiful. But the specifics of that, how it actually looks and feels a little nebulous, I think, until I get that sample design to really kind of look at. I mean, not to say that there wouldn't be conversations before getting the sample design on what it might look like. But I mean, to me, I can't quite think of what the book is going to look like until I see the photography sometimes. But I feel like some people are just a little bit more design forward. I mean, Andrea, what about you? You probably have a pretty clear idea.
Well, one of the things that I think about is the trim size of the book.
So let me stop you right there. What's trim size?
The overall dimensions of a book, which is pretty much determined early on by your editor and you. And so with a book like the Banh Mi Handbook, which came out in 2014, I wanted something little that people could just hold in their hands.
Like a sandwich.
Exactly, like a little sandwich. And similarly with the pho cookbook, I wanted something a little bit bigger than banh mi because pho is bigger. Yet I also wanted this transportive feel of being in Vietnam. So pho had location shots in Vietnam. So I wanted to incorporate that mood and feel of being in country to tell the story of this noodle soup. And so when we got to Vietnamese Food Any Day, it was more like, hey, I want it to feel like this is doable in any kitchen. You don't have to be in Vietnam. So it really, for me, I start thinking about it then. I also photograph very simply the dishes that I make during recipe development. So I think about the look of it. My designer, my editor, we're all looking at the images at the end. So is the photographer and stylist.
Kate, you and I are a little more on the same. It's still pretty nebulous. I haven't thought that far. Kristin, how about you?
It has definitely depended because if I'm in a co-authoring situation, so if I'm working with a client, let's say, where they have a really defined brand, sometimes we'll actually design the proposal with their brand in mind.
Sure.
And bring that to the publisher. And while we won't necessarily direct the publisher like this is what we want it to look like, we do start that vision. So for example, with the Chef's Garden, the way they prepare their materials, it's like a lot of white space and with just really simple pictures of vegetables that pop. So throughout the proposal, that's what we included. And then the resulting book also had a lot of that feel throughout the design. In my own book, I knew I just wanted it to be beautiful, but I didn't know exactly what that meant.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting about working with a brand, that obviously the design would be built into the brand. But if you're just starting out and you don't have a brand, the design could be wide open. And so where does it start? Say you're working with a traditional publisher, and I think, Kate, you mentioned something called a sample design. What is that and where does that come from?
Well, and that's something I think that's becoming more common. A sample design, I think, is a newer way that publishers are working with with authors and designers. So what that means is it could be material that's either maybe it's writing that was in your proposal, or like I think Kristin mentioned that in a previous podcast, or it's writing that you use from your proposal and you develop a little bit more. You send that to your editor. And a lot of times that's not taken so the editor can get a sense of what the book is like. It's more taken so the designer can have some time to play around and see what sort of works with the size of the length of the head note, the size of the recipe, and how it's going to lay out on the page. And they will do that really early on in the process, especially if there's maybe already some sample photography. And that kind of can actually put the book into a trajectory where if you're still writing it, you might sometimes write with the design in mind at that point. That doesn't always happen, but I do think the design is getting moved up earlier and earlier into the cookbook publishing process. So there is a clear idea by the time the book is for sale, what this book is supposed to look like and where it fits in the market.
It's really interesting you say that, Andrea. I go back to a conversation you and I had. I think it was one of our first conversations. And it was, now that I think about it, it was about design, because we were talking about the place of photographs in cookbooks. And in our careers, we have seen photographs, become more and more paramount in a cookbook and drive the design in many ways. And what I'm hearing Kate say is that, and certainly with Kristin, what you're saying about the brand is the design driving the book a little bit too, so that the two work together.
Right. But my only thing about the sample design is it then starts me thinking about how much word count fits on a page. How long should that head note be? And that really hamstrings me in terms of what I write. But there's a certain point now where I just don't care and I'm just going to write.
Well, let's break down what you might look for in a sample design. Like, okay, we talked about white space. Kristin, you mentioned, how much free space there is on a page. But because the designer, which is a member of the design team, it's a designer that either the publisher has hired or works within the publisher. Sometimes they're freelance, right? Sometimes they work there. But they come up with everything from typeface to, there's so many elements. Let's sort of maybe if we could list some of the elements that we need to be looking at or thinking about that affect the overall design.
There's so many things that you take for granted when you pick up a book. If you pick up a book for the first time and you look through it, you'll notice the title probably, you'll notice the photos, you'll notice the colors. But it might take a few times of looking at that book before you kind of hone in on this is the font that they're using. This is the placement of the page numbers. This is the way that maybe there's two fonts and one of them's for the head notes and one of them is for the ingredient list. These are just some of these details that a designer is putting forth in a sample design.
There's a difference between form and function. And I always think, when it gets down to typeface, I work with the same designer on most of my books. And so when she goes and she picks out the typefaces, we'll do like, say, a sans serif plus a serif. So, like Times Roman is a serif and a sans serif is like Helvetica or Arial.
Cleaner, I think.
Cleaner. I have to tell you all that many years ago, when I was a communication consultant, part of what I pitched in terms of my services and taught myself was graphic design.
No way.
Yeah. So I used to lay out stuff on my own. I created designs. And so I kind of geek out when I take a look at typefaces and I pay attention to what's chosen because that's how a reader reacts on the page to your work. And the typeface it's very important. The white space that Kristin mentioned is like, wow, that gives you, I consider it air, breathing space. Mm-hmm. And all of that comes together. And as you're flipping through a really well-made book, it's a lovely, exciting experience.
And the design almost doesn't call attention to itself in a well-made book, except that you think it's cool, it's beautiful, it's easy, it's somehow. But if you're getting hung up on it, gets in the way, you go back to, what you were saying, Andrea, about form versus function. So say you get your sample pages or your sample design, and it's a few chapters or a few recipes. It contains the elements that are going to be in your book. You've written some sidebars and you don't like it. Or you think it doesn't represent you somehow, or it's not going to work because, as Andrea, you said, your recipes might not fit in that. I mean, I write long. We all know this. And so any designer that's confronted with one of my manuscripts, their challenge is how do I get all of this onto a page so the reader can use this? So say you get a sample design and you're just like, I don't love this. Has that ever happened to you?
I can talk to that actually when I was working with a co-author who had a very strong design sense. When I was working on a book called La Buvette with Camille Formant, her parents are artists in France, and she has a very strong artistic sort of side to her and a very clear understanding of what she liked. So we would go through the sample design and she would immediately call out things I probably wouldn't have picked up on first glance, but things like font choices. She really liked a classic looking typeface. And she also really didn't like when there was way too many colors on a page. So she was always trying to tone down, to pare back, instead of having every, say, new chapter have a new color to start that chapter. She said, can't we just all have the same colors throughout? And so she was really picking up on the nuance of design in a way a designer, I think, would think about it, rather than, say, the average author like me looking at it. And I'm thinking, well, the words actually fit on this page. I wouldn't have to trim too much. That's what I was kind of thinking.
Right.
Phew.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
So I learned so much from that process, because then I started thinking, oh, well, now I'm seeing how it actually is more harmonious. It's like, I think Kristin's talked about that when you're writing a recipe. Sometimes it's better, like, you see what you can take out of the recipe, like that whole Coco Chanel and accessorizing thing, right? It's kind of like that with design too. I mean, if there's not enough design details, it becomes too bare, and it almost looks like, well, maybe somebody could have just designed this, put the photo, put a recipe, maybe 2 columns, done. And that's not quite it either. But there's something about over design and just finding elements that can be pulled out that can really bring a book to life and make it look polished.
Yeah. I wonder, in writing a proposal, I mean, we talked about that a few episodes ago, if more and more people, or if any of you have ever mentioned design or talked about books that, when you talk about comparables, like, these are the types of books I like. These are the types of books that reflect my aesthetic. I've certainly talked about sort of the look and feel in that, in my writing, I want something that feels very practical, very usable, very accessible, without a lot of frilly things. One of the books I shared with you guys was Colombiana, and that book is one of the reasons that it appeals to me is it's so different from mine, but it's just lush and filled and like designed and styled, So there's just so many different ways you can go with it. But I think it's important, kind of goes back to talking about editing too, is like being able to speak up for yourself, but also, for me, respecting the expertise of your design team.
And I do think it can be so important to have a phone call or face-to-face meeting and not just go back and forth over email, especially if you're somebody who, like me, I sometimes lack the language to speak about design. So I wouldn't be able to explain why I don't like something in the way a designer would, but I can use more simple words, and then we can go back and forth and try to understand each other. There are a few things, like in Modern Potluck, for example, I find the titles of the recipes, the color of the lettering is kind of pale. And it was something that bothered me a little bit, and I didn't speak up, and now I wish I did. So I feel like all those things, just ask, just speak up about it. And even if they say, oh, it'll print okay, are you sure? Like, push back a little bit.
And who do you talk to in that case?
You can always start with the editor, but you can ask to have a call with the editor as well as the designer.
I have a question for you, actually, on working with East Coast publishers. How much access do you get with designers? Because I know Andrea and I have had experience with 10 Speed and with Chronicle, and I know, Kristin, you've had experience with Chronicle. Is there a difference between West Coast publishers and East Coast publishers and how they work with the design team? Because I feel very comfortable sort of interacting with the design team in the West Coast, but I don't know if that's the same on an East Coast. And maybe it's not East Coast, West Coast. Maybe it's just individual publishers and how they do things differently.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess in that case, I don't think about it as East Coast versus West Coast. And it seems more like it's team versus team, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to generalize.
Yeah, like if you feel something in your gut with a sample design and you're like, I can't rep that fully.
Yep.
And not just fully, but I got to rep that 150%. And early on in my first book, Into the Vietnamese Kitchen, there was a particular design element. It was a border. And the initial designs had this border on not just the recipe head note, the recipe introductions, but as well on like a lot of other pages. And I felt like that made the book seem so overly precious and East Asian-y and not Southeast Asian, which is where I was coming from.
So it was like a graphic border that...
Yeah, it was a very beautiful, delicate border that remains around the recipe head notes. But I didn't want to see that on every single page. I didn't want it to be that kind of book that screamed a little bit too much Chinese for me.
Cliche almost.
Yeah. And I felt like I don't want that kind of book, but sometimes I've seen like over-designed books with a lot of cultural elements that fits the author.
Yeah.
But that just didn't fit me as a debut author. And I was, oh my God, I was like in my late 30s. So that was a long time ago. And that just, I just didn't think that was me. And I could like go on the road with it. So I talked to my editor and he's like, you're right. We'll take it off.
Yeah.
That's great. That's such a good point. Like the cultural elements of design and feeling comfortable with that.
And I think, I don't know if any of you do this, but when I certainly share the first sample pages with people, because I'm the kind of person that I need to rearrange the furniture and look at it, rearrange it again, look at it. I can't see what the room will look like before I've actually moved the chairs and the couches. So for me, looking at sample pages, I'm like, it's very hard for me to, call out the various elements. So I'll pass them around to people who I trust having a good eye. And also I've learned that especially the first sample, it's just a sample.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just a stab at it.
However, I will say if there's something on the sample design that you don't like, speak your mind at the sample design stage and don't let it fester for 6 months until you get at like what we're about to talk about, the, first pages where your manuscript's been put into a layout. Because at that point, it's trickier and you might get more of a fight because, well, you signed off on, the sample pages that you liked it. So why are all of a sudden you're changing your mind? So it's sample pages really, that's where you can really push for something completely different. And if you've already signed off on sample pages and you want a wholesale change later, it gets a little trickier.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and there's also consideration about paper.
Yes.
Kristin mentioned that with Modern Potluck. I remember I wanted this very creamy paper that had a slight sheen to it. But a lot of times when you're doing acid-free paper, for example, which was a trend for a while, things can look a little bit washed out versus it being printed on a different stock. So that's something to think about also in design, about binding and also about the cover. Oh man, I used to love books with dust jackets, but those seem like for cookbooks, it's
not
just
happening.
A thing of the past, man. I miss dust jackets, but nowadays it's called paper over board, I think.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And there's no dust jacket and it's printed right on the jacket.
But what's crazy too is that you think about it, a lot can change in design in even not just 10 years, but 5 years. I mean, just the trend for, I think around 2008 is when the dust jacket started to sort of be sloughed off. If there was a slow movement, and now it might be sort of retro cool to have a dust jacket, so it's like things come back around. I mean, I think certain things that aren't going anywhere is the more photos you can pack into that cookbook, the more people want photos. They want photos. And so the design needs room for those photos. And I've had cases where there's been too much design and there hasn't been enough room for photos. And this happened. I didn't notice this in the sample design. I noticed this in the first pages. And that was a big headache for, I think, everybody. We figured it out, but it was a process.
You mean the design took up too much space?
Yep.
It squeezed the text and that's what you bring up is that the designer is getting a mandate from the publisher on the length of the book and the price of the book. So they're working within those constraints before they even start. So you get a sample design. I've actually seen a sample design that just has gibberish in the text because I haven't submitted anything because I'm always late with my manuscripts. And so, so they're trying to get going on a design. And so it's just gibberish, but you still need to look at the elements. But then we've talked about first and second passes or pages. We talked about that from an editorial standpoint last time we spoke, but now it's in a design. You're looking at that as well, right?
Right. And I think that the thing that's so different about first pages is you can really like a sample design, but it's a sample. So it's not the whole book in its entirety. And what I found in this one particular project was, even though we all love the sample design, when it came out to a full length book of that sample design, the design started to feel like it was overwhelming the story. And it was actually kind of a battle. It took a lot of conversations. It took me going into the publisher's office and meeting with the designer and editor in in person and going page by page through printed out PDFs to find ways to work around it. And it wasn't a slight on the designer. We still really liked the design. It was just like, well, we understand what happened here, but because the recipe pages it just takes up too much space, there's not enough room for this beautiful photography that's really going to sell the story. It was a learning curve.
You want to speak delicately to people when you express your dismay, because you do want them.
Do we talk too much about dismay on this podcast? Are we
So I think that it's not if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything, because you have to speak up for yourself. But you can find the elements that you do like, especially in early, and ask them to please do more of that and maybe less of this.
Exactly.
Right. Always remember form over function, right? You want people to be able to actually use this book and cook from it.
Well, yeah. And, and the production team is working for you to make the best book possible that, is going to sell well. So they can also, defend themselves if it gets to that. But I always try to cheer people on as much as possible. And they put their best out there for me. But, there are times where I'm just like, all right, this is it. I don't like that so much. But as much as I care about design, and I have to say to you, there are people like Yotam Ottolenghi who very openly discuss how when putting together recipes, Yotam thinks about presentation and styling and design. It reflects on the books that come out of the Ottolenghi production. And so that's something that you want to think about, to a certain extent, of course, because some recipes are not going to be the most beautiful thing, but should be in your book. But, you want to consider, how are things going to look? I grew up with cookbooks that had absolutely no photos. Julia Child's Mastering the Art, no pictures, but I learned so much. Unfortunately, those sorts of books are not as viable. Even a book like Samin Nosrat's has illustrations. So there is plenty of color. It's just a different source of coloring rather than photography.
That's a good question, actually, that I have for the group is, when does the illustration come into the design? Because some books have both photos and illustration. I mean, Andrea and Molly, you both have books with photo illustration. Is the illustration treated like you would photography, or is that coming in earlier into the design phase?
I had illustrations in Asian dumplings for the folding and the shaping, because I wanted something that looked very artful and craft oriented. Nowadays, illustrations cost a lot.
Yeah. And a lot of times that is on the author. Like the design, the publisher is paying for that, but the photography and the illustration, it really depends on your deal. And often the author will pay for those out of their advance. So that's just something to keep in mind when you look at books and see all these lush illustrations.
Right. So even though an illustration, meaning a line drawing, looks like a design element, it's considered art, which is part of the photography budget.
Correct.
It comes out of the advance, the author's earnings.
Yeah. And in the Banh Mi handbook, there were a couple of little illustrations that I did myself, the line drawings I did. And then there are these chapter openers that I somehow talked my designer into doing. And so she actually did like these really cute illustrations for each of the chapter openers.
That's so cool. That's so smart.
Yeah.
Probably if you have somebody who
save you $5,000
is up for that. And
I had illustrations in my first two books. And the first book, I think, the reason is because we had the photographs were inserts, and this is a really old term. I don't even know if it still applies, but it was not a 4-color print book, which meant that you couldn't just integrate the photographs into the book. They were printed separately and quite literally inserted. So and you'll see this in older books, you'll flip through and there's just suddenly a whole stash of photos. And then you flip through and, there's all just text pages. In order to get more sort of visual in the book, we went with illustrations. Also, a lot of what's in those illustrations are cuts of meat, because it's a very meat-centric book. And photographing meat is really difficult. And the illustrations are beautiful and actually, I think, more helpful because you're able to really see the various grains and shapes. And so that was sort of very fun to work on those. And So that carried over into the second book, even though it was full color. You really liked that idea of illustrations, but then they got dropped in the last book. So it's interesting.
The way you said how meat is so hard to photograph, I would almost love to see a chart of like the rise of photography in cookbooks as well as plant-based cookbooks or something.
Right?
Oh, that's true. That is so true.
Yeah.
Oh, God,
It's
all
really
the colors,
interesting.
all the pomegranate seeds on everything.
You bring up a question about trend, and I think it's really interesting to think about when you're envisioning a design, or if you do, and you're thinking about the type of book you're writing. Are you writing a book that you want to be super popular, super fast, super on trend and of the moment? Or are you looking for a book that might be more timeless? But I think that's important to think about, that if you're doing something that's too on trend, is it going to look out of style in 10 years, 5 years, 3 years?
Yeah, it's so true. Things can look dated really fast.
It's true, but it's really hard to predict trends as well. You know, it's like you want to go for that timeless design, but sometimes maybe it won't look as timeless as you had in mind in 5 years. There's certain things that just seem more classic. If you're doing a lot of things that look like they've ripped out of a magazine this year, they might look a little tired in 2 years, 3 years. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to pinpoint a trend.
Well, not really, you guys. I mean,
No?
like in like home design, home decor, they always ask you, are you modern? Are you traditional? Are you transitional?
Ooh.
I'm always the transitional.
So are your books transitional?
I hope so. So they can they appeal at launch and they continue on for years. That's what I hope for.
I guess that's another thing. Like if you have a brand that is really strong visually, like in the end, as long as your brand is lasting, then the book design will be lasting.
Good point.
And if you're a Instagrammer or TikToker, and your brand, I would imagine your book should match that, right? So it's recognizable.
Correct.
Yeah, if what you're doing has like a strong visual sense.
Yeah.
I would push back on branding in that if your brand uses a certain type of typeface or something, you don't necessarily need to use the identical one in the book to also feel like it's part of the family. You know, especially say with restaurant books, like you don't necessarily need to have the same looking restaurant signage on the front cover. This cookbook is from this restaurant.
Yeah.
It's true. And I guess like even for a food brand, you want the book to appeal to people who aren't already customers. It's not like a sales piece. It's an extension of your brand.
I had an interesting conversation with a book designer who was saying that she's seeing more people more new authors coming with their own team. They're showing up with a designer that they've worked with. So it's someone who's already has a platform and bringing a designer along. And obviously that's a different relationship that we're talking about, working with a publisher who has a designer on their team, either in-house or freelance, but that they've hired. And as Kristin, as you said, that they're paying for.
I got to tell you, I was at the airport a few years ago in a bookstore. I picked up Snoop Dogg's cookbook, and it's very well branded to meet his needs. And it's a fun book. His voice is there, the design's there, the photography's there. It's awesome. It has
sold so well.
Yeah. And I believe he brought in his own designer, and someone like Michelle Tam of Nom Nom Paleo, her husband does the design work on her books, and they are extremely on brand with that kind of, illustrated book look to them. There's all different ways that you can do this, as long as at the end of the day, you can sell it. And that's what really is important. We'll talk about sales and promotion and stuff in a future episode. But at the design level, you're thinking about all of these things coming together because the design is about the future impact of your work once it's released.
Absolutely. And I think what you just said there, Andrea, about you can sell it. One of the things that we have in common is when we talk about selling books, we're writing books that are useful books. We're writing books that we want the function to at least match the form, that we want it to be a useful cookbook, and we want to be able to cook from it successfully, happily. And that's why we, work our tails off getting the recipes to work, why you test as much as you do and as carefully and all of that. So when you get a design, we're looking, we don't want to talk too much about our, complaining about things, but what are you, what are you looking for that, I know for me, like columns, are the recipe, are the ingredients in columns, how the page breaks are, what are those? Those are all design elements. What are some of those things that you just really want to zone in on and make sure your cook at home, the user, is going to have the best experience from your book, the way it's laid out?
I look at page number placement. That is such a mundane thing, but I think sometimes the placement of the page number, it just can get a little like new and edgy. And I kind of like it in the corner, the right or left-hand corner, because it's easier when I'm flipping through personally. And that's just something that I will, if it's in the middle of the page, on the top of the page, I can't flip through the book. It's harder for me to compute
so
that.
You look at the index and you're looking for the recipe for chocolate pudding, and you find it's on page 97, and then to find page 97, I
have to scan the whole page to see where the number is.
Yeah.
So things like that those are like little things that I look at. If the placement of the page number is too creative for me, I will push back on that.
That's funny. I never thought about that, to be honest.
It's a ridiculous little thing, but it's my pet peeve.
It's funny. I'm looking at the salty cookbook that I mentioned in an episode or two ago, and their page number is right in the middle. So I guess they got edgy with it.
And I bet a designer would roll their eyes at me calling that edgy, but that's like, I guess that's where I roll.
My last book, they did the shading for the sidebars. So they all had this green, which I was really nervous about the green. I wasn't sure, but I think it works. And I'm happy with it in the end. But it was used for sidebar material. And if it was a full bleed, meaning the color, the green went all the way to the edge of the page, they didn't want to put a page number on those pages. And I was like,
no bueno.
No bueno.
It was interesting, but those are the kinds of things you want to make sure people can find the page numbers.
Yes. That's such a good example of a kind of conversation you would have with the design team, though. Right. It's like, come on, guys, let's work together on this page number thing.
I have a thing about bindings that I want it to fall flat. In the kitchen.
You and my mom, she hates it when she gets a book and she's like, I can't cook from that book. It doesn't open. It won't fall flat.
A sewn binding versus a glued binding. It's like sewed together, and they're like these little stacks of pages of paper that are called signatures. And when you open the book, it just sits beautiful. It's like, oh, it's like the Bible, in your kitchen.
Into that.
Yeah, and you made this, and when the sun casts its glimmer light on there, and you see that shadow of a beautifully open book, it makes you smile and it brings you joy.
Yeah.
So binding is something that's really important. The type of paper that's used is important to me. Also going back to typefaces. So you can do all kinds of things. Like if there's something dark and they do what's called a reverse type. So say it's white upon, black or some dark color, you want to be able to make sure that that's all legible. You can use like the same typeface, but in different weights. So a thin weight versus a heavy weight. So then that creates this depth, and it allows elements in your book to pop. And that also is about the mood and feel of a book. So I take a look at the typeface a lot. The photography, I love my images to be really crisp and clear. And a lot of people like a little bit more, they want things to blur a little bit. But people are looking at my recipes and they're like looking at as a guide to cooking too. So I have to be very aware of that notion that the book is a teaching element as well as an artful thing to have in your life.
Right. It's a beautiful object, but it's also a reference book. Yeah. And we will talk about photography at depth in another episode, but it is certainly something to consider. We already talked about how it weaves into the design and how it reflects the design.
For sure.
Absolutely. One thing actually that's helped me is that when I'm trying to figure out what kinds of book design I like, and if a publisher's asking me for ideas, sometimes I'll ask them to send me books that they're thinking will look in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's a paper stock. If you're not sure what a paper stock looks like, and you're like, I don't know if I want this matte or what this other paper looks like, they can send you sample books of that have been printed on that paper so you can get a feel for what it's going to look like. The book design might not match at all what your book is, but you can get a sense of the paper stock and maybe even the trim size.
Yeah, you just mentioned matte, and I think one of the things it's becoming increasingly popular is to print on a matte, not a glossy page. And I think it's really important to consider how the photographs are going to show up on that. As you said, if you're not sure of that, ask for a sample or maybe even talk to the photographer about that too, because I've had a conversation with a photographer who found that they were going to be printing on matte, and they were not happy because, they thought their photographs would get muddied or wouldn't really shine. And so it's important to know that going in, what is the paper? I mean, that was the beauty of inserts, is you could have one paper for the text and one glossy for the photographs.
Oh yeah. Inserts are that's in the center of the book, when there would be just some photographs.
Yeah. I know that was an era.
Yeah, that was. I lived through it.
When people are taking a look at book designs, go to a bookstore, check out, a cookbook bookstore in particular, and perhaps talk to the people who run the shop and see what they're looking at that's exciting to them. And also take a look at books that are published overseas, say Australia and the UK, which oftentimes have much more design forward concepts. I have one that's practically crazy carpeting that was produced in Australia that was just so amazing, but I knew it would never ever sell. It was flocked, wallpaper on the cover. And I was like, I know this will never ever sell in America, but I just wanted to own that book so I could touch it.
Yeah, there's some really fun things like that, like pop-ups and fold-outs and all that. I always wanted a book that had those ribbons that the old Joy of Cooking used to have, that were page holder or place marks, but no one's
Dory Greenspan's, the previous one, has those ribbons. I know this because my mom told me about this, and she appreciated it because not only does the book lie flat, she has these ribbons to mark where the next recipe she wants to try, and she loves that book.
I'm pretty sure Sarah Kiefer's 100 Cookies has ribbons, which I actually really love.
That's awesome. Boy, the show notes are going to be filled with book titles tonight after this episode. Somebody mentioned dust jackets. So should we talk a little bit about covers?
Dun,
they're kind of the biggest expression of design in some ways.
Don't judge a book by its cover, but
everyone
you do.
does.
It's
so true.
It's the first thing you see. It's the first impression.
Yeah.
So it's so important. And I feel like a lot of times there is some tension between the author and maybe editorial and then the sales department. The sales department might have a totally different vision.
Right.
So
the book designer might not necessarily have designed the cover. It might be somebody else on the design team or the production team that's come up with the cover, because that really is a sales element.
Right.
And depending on your audience, and if you are the person, if you're the draw, no, they might say, we want you on the cover. And you might be like, I just want the food on the cover. Right. I mean, you work with the publisher to come to an agreement, but they have a lot of sway.
Yeah. And design wise, let's say you have a photograph on the cover that takes up a full bleed photograph going all edge to edge. Then your title has to fit somewhere on that cover as well as your name. And so sometimes that can be problematic, but you just got to work with it. And thinking about what's going to go on the cover. Is it just words? Is it a design? Or is it a beauty shot of some food from one of the recipes inside the book? And I know a lot of European books. Celia Sack from Omnivore Books had a conversation going on Twitter a few years ago about European covers and how they were so, awesome in their just design with elements and these really beautiful graphics versus American ones, which were so detailed with actual food. And she preferred the more arty covers from Europe. But, you can do things many different ways nowadays, just to be mindful of how that's going to affect your target audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. And the reason, I think if you look at Ottolenghi's Simple, it's a totally different cover. And I think Celia was talking about this. It's like a lemon in the UK, but here it's food. It's multiple plates of food. And the publisher clearly believed that would sell more copies in the US for the US market. So no matter how beautiful that single lemon was, the decision was really a sales decision. It wasn't an artistry decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like in the US we're so much more literal. I think actually for his book Flavor, they did a poll. I can't remember if it was Ottolenghi or it was 10 Speed, but they did a poll. Yeah.
So right. Yeah.
And I remember thinking this is my favorite, but this is the one that's going to win or something like that. I'm pretty sure it's right.
I think it really does come down to the cover ends up being a negotiation between the sales team, the design team, the author, the editor, everybody involved.
Yeah. People have looked at the cover of my books and they'll send me something on social media and they'll say, my son saw the cover of your book and said, I want to make that. And so that's a reaction that I never thought of because I think of it's a food that is evocative of the cuisine and the mood that's not too challenging for people to make, that will just draw them into the book. But to get a reaction like, I want to make that, it looks so good, that's really, then I feel like the cover for me has served its purpose.
Yeah, that's great.
That's a really good point. And the thing is, too, the cover has to fit in a very small little square online when people are browsing online. So
right, there's that to think about.
There's so many, covers are so hard. And I think they've gotten even more difficult.
Yeah. And that's why I really do respect the sales team on this one, but I also want to make sure it's something, because you're the one who's going to have to go out and sell it too. So you need to love it enough. I wish I had knew a lot of this when I first started out, but should we do a lightning round and takeaways?
Sure.
Andrea, you want to kick us off?
I'm going to start looking at page number placement after hearing about Kate's considerations. Man, oh man. And I want to get kind of artful with those page numbers too. Maybe a circle or some color.
Ooh.
What about you all?
I guess it's not a takeaway. I'm gonna add on, but it'll be fast. And it has to do with the little boxes that you might put throughout and making sure the placement of those makes sense. So you might have a little add-on to your recipe, like a make ahead or a note or shopping instruction. But the good designers are usually reading, but not always. There might just be something that's like illogically placed. So I always make sure to look out for that.
Good add-on. And my quick takeaway is, if you're looking at a cookbook that you really like the design, think about what you like about it and try to not factor in the photography into that decision. Just look at how the words look. Look at the freaking, page number. Look at the title and see if this is the way you want people to see your recipes.
And the font, which we've learned we call typeface in design
not
circles,
font, which
not
I
font,
call font,
even
because I'm like on Microsoft Word choosing my Times New Roman.
Right,
hey,
speak
we all
the
know what you
mean.
Speak design language.
I might have said font too.
Yeah, they know what you mean. And if anybody wants a deeper dive into this book design process, you can tune into a mini episode of Everything Cookbooks where I talked to Alice Chow, a San Francisco-based cookbook designer, about her experience on the inside of the design process. I learned a ton from speaking with her too, and I think everybody will too. So, we talk about cookbooks, and we're all devoted to cookbooks and all types of books. And, when we're sitting on these video chats, I'm always like looking at your bookshelves and what's on your desk and trying to scope out what you're looking at these days. But anybody want to share a title that they've learned from, inspired by, rely on?
So very close to my desk is a shelf full of dictionaries and style manuals. It's so boring, right? But I have foreign language dictionaries and, English dictionaries, as well as something called a pocket style manual by Diana Hacker and Nancy Summers. And it's a tiny little slender book that is spiral bound. A writing teacher friend of mine at a local community college recommended it to me several years ago when I was working, I think, on my first book, actually. It's super handy because you can open up these books and find answers to grammar questions that you may have forgotten from grade school or junior high, and also reminders about being clear in your writing and brief. As well as APA and MLA and whatever little style things. Even though nowadays, I think for me, like Chicago Manual Style is what I was using years ago. And I have like a big, thick copy of it, but it's outdated. And I just go online for that when I need it. But I do love these style manuals because they keep me, in line, I guess. Do you guys use style manuals?
Yes.
I do. I should use them more because sometimes I'm like, I need to look that up in the style manual and I'll just highlight it for later. And I'm not a procrastinator about most things, but about that kind of thing, I'm a procrastinator because I'm like, then I could go down a rabbit hole and spend 30 minutes looking up all this other fun stuff and then forget where I left off on what I'm writing. So
I have to say there's some good online tools for this as well. So I think, I guess what I was going to say is I tend to rely on either a publication style guide if they provide one, but usually that's very specific. But I guess for the more general questions, I tend to look online. And I also do pay for the professional version of Grammarly. I guess for a book, you can run it through Grammarly. It's a lot. Like it has a lot of processing power. But when I am clear-headed enough to do this, I will put like an email or a blog post or anything through Grammarly, and it'll obviously does spelling, but it'll like highlight some other things or say like, hey, do you want to change this word because this word might be more impactful or So it's a cool tool.
I love that you brought that book to us today, Andrea, especially after this discussion about design, which was sort of about how things look, and you're bringing us right back to making sure that that's good, solid writing.
The words are what brought us here, you guys.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Molly.
Woohoo! Yay, Molly. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have questions or comments, ping us on Instagram at Everything Cookbooks, or check out our website, everythingcookbooks.com. Thanks to our editor, Abby Circatella. If you have a minute, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This helps us build the Everything Cookbooks community. And be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.